Every night like clockwork, a small grizzly bear cub would curl up on the concrete steps of a rural Montana hospital. He never roared. He never ran. He just waited. The nurses thought it was strange. Security tried to chase him away. But the cub kept coming back. Then one night, a doctor followed him into the woods, just once, and what he discovered changed his life forever. This is a true story about grief, instinct, and a bond deeper than anyone could have imagined. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us continue to bring you real, powerful stories like this one. Dr. Paul Jensen didn't believe in fairy tales. He believed in data. In diagnosis. In hard nights, long shifts, and the quiet exhaustion of keeping a rural hospital running when you're all that stands between someone and the end. It was early October when the first nurse mentioned the bear cub. "He's back again," she'd whispered during shift change, glancing out the window toward the emergency room entrance. "Bear cub?" Paul asked, half listening. She nodded. "Every night, about 10 p.m. He curls up on the steps outside the ER and just sleeps." Paul raised an eyebrow. "And no one's called animal control?" "They came," the nurse said. "Twice. But by the time they arrived, he was gone." Paul shrugged. "Must be orphaned. Happens this time of year. Just don't feed it." But that night, around 9:50 p.m., he stepped outside with his coffee in hand, and there he was. A tiny brown bear cub, maybe 20 or 25 pounds, sitting on the bottom step with his front paws tucked neatly beneath him. His fur was patchy in spots, slightly matted. His ears twitched at every sound, but he didn't move. Paul stood completely still. The cub glanced up at him, not with fear, but something gentler. Recognition. Then slowly, the cub rested his head on his paw and closed his eyes. Paul watched for almost 10 minutes before heading back inside. The next night, the cub returned. Same time, same place. And the next. By the fourth night, the hospital staff had stopped pretending it wasn't happening. A nurse left a bowl of water near the bushes. Another brought out a fleece blanket. Paul told them to stop, gently, but firmly. "He's still a wild animal," he said. "He needs to return to the forest." But he wasn't so sure anymore. Because something about the cub felt off. He wasn't searching through trash. He wasn't trying to get inside. He didn't cry. Didn't make noise. He just waited. And slept on the cold concrete. Every single night. One Friday evening, Paul stayed late, doing paperwork in his office near the ER doors. At 9:48 p.m., he stood, walked to the window, and looked out. The cub was already there, sitting, facing the doors. Waiting for something, or someone, that wasn't coming. Paul felt a weight in his chest he couldn't name. He stepped outside again, this time slower. "Hey," he said quietly. The cub didn't run. He looked at Paul, then lowered his head again. And in that moment, something stirred. Deep and sudden, like a memory or a grief Paul hadn't fully admitted. The bear was waiting for someone. And Paul was starting to wonder who it was. Saturday night, and the emergency room had finally gone quiet. No traumas. No walk-ins. Just a low hum from machines behind the nurse's station and the occasional beep from a monitor. Paul didn't plan to follow the bear. Not really. He told himself he was just stepping out for air. But at 9:53 p.m., he walked through the automatic glass doors and stood on the steps. The cub was already there, curled into himself, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cold. Paul paused. "Where do you go when you leave?" The cub blinked up at him. No growl. No flinch. Just calm. Paul took a few steps down the path leading to the wooded lot behind the hospital. The land wasn't much, just a narrow strip of pine and fir trees separating the facility from the mountains beyond. Nobody really went there. Except now, apparently, the bear. Paul looked back once. The hospital's soft lights glowed behind him. He turned forward. "Okay then," he said. "Let's go." The cub stood, stretched his legs, and walked into the trees. It was darker under the canopy. The moon hadn't risen yet, and the air smelled like cold earth and pine sap. Paul moved slowly, boots crunching over damp needles. He followed from a distance. The cub didn't run. He weaved through the trees, padding over roots and rocks with the ease of something born to move silently. Paul's breath was steady, but his heart wasn't. It thudded harder with each step. Then the cub stopped. And Paul saw it. At the base of a tree, barely visible through the brush, was a canvas backpack, weathered, torn, covered in dirt. Next to it, a jacket. Small and pink. Child-sized. Folded carefully. Paul froze. He moved closer, crouching. The cub sat just behind him, watching. The backpack was partially open. Inside were a few crumpled granola bar wrappers, a flashlight with a dead battery, and a notebook. Paul picked it up gently, flipping to the first page. A child's handwriting. "My name is Emily. I'm 7. If you find this, I need help. I think my mom is gone. But I have a friend. He's small and fuzzy. He stays with me every night." Paul's breath hitched. His throat burned. The pages that followed were dated. They told a story of a hiking trip gone wrong. A mother who'd fallen. A child who waited. Days stretched into weeks. And all the while, the fuzzy friend never left. One page stood out. "I named him Acorn. He's not scary. He sleeps by me when I'm cold. I think he misses his mom too." Paul stared at the cub sitting beside the tree like a silent guardian. "Acorn," he whispered. The bear tilted his head. Paul looked deeper into the woods. "How long were you out here?" He radioed for search and rescue. The signal was patchy, but enough. Within hours, a recovery team was combing the area. They found Emily's body the next morning, tucked under a fallen pine, wrapped in the jacket that had been neatly folded by the tree. There was no sign of the mother. But what stunned everyone, what made hardened rescue workers go silent, was that Acorn, the little bear cub, had been seen in paw prints circling both the girl's body and the hospital trail. Over and over. For weeks. He had been walking back and forth from the woods to the hospital. Every single night. As if waiting for someone to come. That morning, Paul sat on the ER steps as the sun rose, watching Acorn rest nearby, finally sleeping, without the weight of waiting. He didn't understand it fully. He didn't need to. What he did know was this cub had kept vigil over a child when no one else could, and somehow, he brought her back home. Paul had worked at North Ridge Regional Hospital for over 17 years. He delivered babies, patched up gunshot wounds, held hands during final breaths, but nothing prepared him for the day a bear cub was loaded into a state wildlife truck just after sunrise, and he felt like something vital was being taken from him. Acorn had been sedated gently by the wildlife team. No tranquilizers, just a safe sedative in food. He didn't resist. He didn't growl. He just looked back once, drowsy, confused, right at Paul, and Paul's chest clenched in a way he hadn't felt since his own son was born. The ranger in charge, Officer Dana Clean, was sympathetic but firm. He's underweight, dehydrated, and possibly imprinted. He's going to the rehab facility in Bozeman. Paul stood stiffly. What happens after that? If he can be rewilded, we'll do it. If not, he might be transferred to a sanctuary or permanently placed. Permanently placed? Paul asked, his voice tight. Clean didn't blink. Somewhere safe. But not here. The staff watched the truck pull away in silence. A nurse wiped at her eyes. It wasn't just about the bear anymore. It was about what he represented. He'd come back every night, slept by the doors, waited, not for food, but for someone to see what he couldn't say. He had stayed when no one else could. And now he was gone. Paul didn't sleep that night. Instead, he pulled Emily's notebook from his desk drawer and read it again. He sleeps by me when I'm cold. I think he misses his mom too. The pages were worn now, but her words lived between them like breath. She had been alone, terrified, starving, and Acorn had stayed. By Monday morning, Paul had made his decision. He drove 5 hours to Bozeman, sat outside the Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and waited until the director finally agreed to see him. I know he's a wild animal, Paul said. I know he can't live with people. I'm not asking that. The director, a lean woman named Carol Foster, nodded slowly. Then what are you asking? Paul took a breath. I'm asking you not to treat him like an orphan. He's not just another cub. He kept a child warm while she died. He brought her back to us. He found her family when no one else could. Carol studied him for a long moment, then asked something unexpected. Do you have kids? Paul blinked. I had a daughter. The silence between them stretched. She was 7, he continued quietly, just like Emily. He looked down. I couldn't save her. Carol nodded once. We'll hold off on relocation. But he can't stay here forever. Paul stood. I understand. As he turned to leave, she added. You know, animals don't grieve like we do. But they do grieve. Sometimes in ways we don't understand. Paul looked over his shoulder. I think that's exactly what he's doing. Back at the hospital, Paul found himself walking to the ER steps out of habit. The concrete was empty, but the memory of that little bear, curled up, silent, and waiting, stayed. The town was talking. The story had reached the local news. Some were calling Acorn a hero. Others weren't sure what to believe. But Paul didn't care, because in his heart something had cracked open, not because of what Acorn had done, but because of what Paul had finally allowed himself to feel: loss, connection, and the terrifying, beautiful truth of staying when it hurts the most. It was a small meeting room inside a courthouse annex, but it might as well have been a stadium for how loud Paul's heart was pounding. The State Wildlife Advisory Panel sat at a long table, 3 people in jackets with government logos, one with a notepad, another scrolling through a laptop. Across from them, Paul sat alone, a doctor in hospital scrubs holding a file folder that contained nothing but a notebook written by a dead child. Dr. Jensen, one panelist began, you've asked to speak regarding the rehabilitation and potential release of a juvenile grizzly bear. Is that correct? Paul nodded. Yes. His name is, well, we called him Acorn. A flicker of interest. One of the panelists raised an eyebrow. You believe this bear showed unusual behavior? Paul opened the folder, placed Emily's notebook on the table gently. I believe he showed loyalty. Grief. Something we don't even have a proper word for. Silence. I don't think he followed instinct, Paul said slowly. I think he followed memory. He spoke for over 20 minutes, about the hospital, about the nights the cub came to sleep on the concrete, about the trail through the forest, about the backpack, the jacket, the body. He read passages from Emily's notebook, her drawings of the bear, the way she wrote about him as if he were more than a companion, more than a pet. A protector. One panelist looked visibly shaken. Another tapped their pen without looking up. Then they asked him, "Why does this matter so much to you?" Paul hesitated, then exhaled. Because 10 years ago, I lost my daughter to leukemia. The room went still. She was 7, just like Emily. And I wasn't there when she passed. I was in surgery. I thought I had time. He looked down. His voice cracked. I didn't. Another pause. Then. I've spent every day since convincing myself I couldn't feel it. That it was just life. But watching that cub, watching him not give up on a child he could have walked away from, it broke me open. He looked up, eyes glassy. And maybe that's not science. But it's something I think we should honor. After his testimony, Paul walked out into the cool late autumn air and sat on the courthouse steps. He didn't know what the panel would decide. But for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel like he was hiding behind medicine or duty. He had spoken with his whole heart. And it was because of a bear. That evening, Carol Foster from the Wildlife Rehab Center called him. They're reviewing options, she said, but they were moved. Deeply. Paul swallowed hard. What about Acorn? He's calm. Alert. Still won't eat unless we sit with him. Paul closed his eyes. He's waiting. Carol paused. I think he misses her. 2 days later, Paul received a letter with an official seal, the state's decision. He unfolded it slowly. The panel had approved a one-time exception. Acorn would be placed under long-term monitored care, not in a zoo, not in the wild, but near Northridge Hospital, with freedom to roam within a protected, enclosed forested area, accessible, observed, respected. Paul didn't cry when he read it, but he did smile, because somehow, Acorn had found his way back again. The clearing behind Northridge Hospital had been fenced in carefully, not with metal and barbed wire, but with tall wooden posts and natural brush, designed to blend into the forest rather than cage it. It was large, spanning acres, enough for a bear to walk, climb, dig. There was a freshwater stream rerouted through the back edge, and logs were left scattered, untouched. A soft, mulched trail looped quietly along the perimeter. It wasn't the wild, but it wasn't captivity either. It was a place between, just like Acorn. The day he returned, it was raining lightly, a drizzle that painted the pine needles silver. Paul waited near the gate, watching the transport vehicle back into position. Acorn stepped out slowly, no sedation this time, no leash. He walked with the same quiet alertness he'd always had, low to the ground, eyes sharp but calm. He paused, sniffed the air, then turned toward Paul. Paul didn't move. Acorn didn't either. Then slowly, the cub, larger now, heavier, but still unmistakably him, walked across the clearing and sat right on the edge of the hospital's line of sight, right where he used to sleep. He didn't come closer that day. He didn't need to. Paul stood in the rain for a long time, watching, being watched, no words, just the wind and the steady rhythm of raindrops on leaves. Days passed, then weeks. Acorn explored his space, climbed trees, rolled in dirt, pulled bark from logs, and napped beneath the shade of heavy branches. But every evening, sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m., he would wander back toward the same spot, where the concrete path met the edge of the forest, where a little girl once waited to be found, where a doctor once didn't know how to feel, and he would sit. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours, just there. Paul began to meet him. Not every night, but enough. He'd walk out of the ER, lean against the wooden railing, and drink his coffee while Acorn sat in the dark, maybe 10 feet away, chewing softly on a stick or just watching the moon. Sometimes Paul spoke quietly, about work, about Lily, his daughter, about how she used to wear rainbow boots even when it wasn't raining, about the things he never said to her because he was always on call. Acorn never made a sound, but Paul swore he listened. One night, Paul brought something with him, Emily's notebook. He read from it aloud, not to himself, to Acorn. It was a page the girl had scribbled in the dark: "If I don't wake up, I want him to stay near me so I'm not alone." Paul's hands shook. "I think you did exactly that," he whispered. Acorn blinked slowly and lowered his head to the earth. That was the night Paul cried. Not in guilt. Not in grief. But in release. Because for the first time, the pain wasn't trapped inside him, it had somewhere to go. And strangely, that place was a bear. The storm came fast. Wind screamed through the trees like a living thing, tearing branches from trunks and snapping power lines across the outskirts of town. Rain hammered the ground in sheets, turning the hospital parking lot into a shallow lake. By morning, half of Acorn's enclosure had collapsed under a fallen pine, and he was gone. Paul arrived breathless, soaked through to the skin. The gate hung open, bent. Paw prints led into the trees, but the ground was too torn up to follow clearly. Search teams went out. Wildlife officers joined them. People asked Paul if the bear had attacked anyone. He said no. They asked if it was possible Acorn had gone wild again. He said he didn't know. But inside, something told him the bear hadn't run, not away, but toward something. 3 nights passed, no sightings, no movement. Just storm-wrecked wood and worry. Paul barely slept. He kept checking the trail every evening, walking past the old place where Acorn used to sit. The silence there now felt unbearable, like a heart no longer beating. And then, on the 4th night, just after sunset, he saw him, emerging from the dark trees. Acorn, dirty, limping slightly, but alive. And not alone. In his jaws, carefully, like he was carrying something fragile, was a torn piece of fabric, pink, faded. A child's jacket. Paul's breath caught. Acorn padded forward and dropped it at the edge of the trail, then sat exactly where he used to. Paul stepped closer, slowly. He reached down and picked up the fabric, the same jacket from the backpack in the woods, the one Emily had written about in her notebook. And wrapped inside it, a photograph. Warped, water-damaged, but visible. A woman and a little girl, smiling. Not a selfie, taken by someone else. A hand could be seen at the edge of the frame. A man's. Paul stared. How? Where had this come from? Had Acorn remembered where she'd died? Or gone back to where she'd lived? Had he found what the rescue team had missed? Or was it just a last piece of her, unearthed by the storm? Paul sank to his knees in the mud, the photo trembling in his hand. Acorn sat beside him, closer than ever. Quiet. Still. Watching. The next day, the story broke again, this time, national, bear returns missing item from lost child's past. Grizzly cub shows signs of memory and attachment beyond instinct. Doctor credits bear with helping him heal. But Paul didn't care about headlines. He only cared that Acorn had come back. That he hadn't run from the storm. That something inside that bear, whatever it was, had held on to the girl, to the story, to the place where she'd last been held by warmth. That week, they built a new section of the enclosure, stronger, wider. But Paul knew now that fences weren't what kept Acorn near. It was choice. It was connection. And in some impossible, primal way, it was love. Years passed. The storm damage faded. Acorn grew, not into a giant. He'd always been smaller than most. But into something steady. Children visited his sanctuary from schools across the region, not to see a spectacle, but to listen. The story was printed on a plaque by the enclosure trail. Teachers read it aloud, some cried halfway through, the bear who waited, the bear who remembered, the bear who brought her home. But even as the world moved on, the hospital never forgot, and neither did Paul. By now, his hair had gone mostly gray. He'd stopped taking night shifts, but he still came by every evening, sometimes to walk the loop, sometimes just to sit on the bench where the girl's jacket had been returned, sometimes to talk. Not because Acorn responded, but because he always listened. It was a late afternoon in early spring when it happened. A school group had visited that morning and most were gone, but one little girl stayed behind, lagging near the trail's edge. She was about 7, quiet, her jacket a bright, soft pink. Paul approached gently. "You okay?" She looked up with wide eyes. He was watching me. Paul followed her gaze. Acorn stood near the edge of the trees, not in the enclosure, but just inside the natural border where the fence gave way to a shallow ravine lined with old pines. He was still like a statue, but his eyes were locked on the girl. "What's your name?" Paul asked. "Lily," she said. He smiled. "That was my daughter's name too." The girl opened her hand. Inside was a tiny pine cone, smooth, old, the edges dulled by weather. "I found it near the log. I wanted to give it to him." Paul knelt beside her. "You can leave it right here," he said gently. "He'll see it." She placed the pine cone on a rock carefully. Acorn didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, not fast, not loud, but deliberate. He reached the rock, sniffed the pine cone, and then, in a motion so quiet Paul almost missed it, he bowed his head and sat right there, facing her. Lily smiled. And for a moment there was no fence, no years, no story, just a child and a bear and a space between them filled with something unspoken. Paul felt his eyes fill, because Acorn hadn't forgotten, not Emily, not the waiting, not the pain. And somehow, not the kindness either. That night, Paul wrote in his journal, "I thought I was broken when I found him, but maybe we were both just holding the same grief in different shape. Now I know love doesn't need language. Sometimes it just stays. And sometimes it returns." If this story touched your heart, remember, compassion isn't limited to humans, loyalty isn't taught, and sometimes healing comes from where you least expect it. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes the wild still has something to teach us. Because this little bear did more than survive, he stayed.